All right, now, so we're moving on with the stages of the path. We've had the first two meditations, the first two shamatha meditations, and we've had the discursive meditations of the preliminary thoughts that turn the mind towards the path of Dharma, that turn the mind towards the path of authentic spirituality and the development of the heart and the mind. And so now, as we have turned away from one way of being, as we have realized the futility of a certain path and have now gained an interest in a new path, a new way of doing things, this brings up one of the core Buddhist acts. It is actually the act that makes you a Buddhist in this context, but it's also the act, I would say, that makes you a whatever you are. And that is the act of refuge. So we all take refuge in something. As we talked about before, some people take refuge in their status in society. Some people take refuge in their money. Some people take refuge in their spouse, or they take refuge in their children, or in their parents, or someone takes refuge in drugs or TV or whatever it might be, or a certain way of life. We all pick something basically, or an array of things that we go to for refuge, right? That we go to for comfort, for protection, for and that serve as our path in a way. So within the Buddhist setting and within any religious setting, there's the taking of refuge in whatever the objects of refuge are for that particular tradition. So in Christianity, it would be, in a way, taking refuge in Jesus, accepting Jesus as your Savior. In Islam, it would be, accepting Allah as your God, and Muhammad as the Prophet, and so on and so forth. And in Judaism, accepting the one God as your God, and the one and only God, and so on. And in Hinduism, it would be, whether it's Krishna or Vishnu, or Shiva, or one of these other deities, take refuge in the deity as the symbol of the highest principle. And in Buddhism, you take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And we can really think of this as a very universal way of taking refuge. That's one of the things I really like about the Buddhist framework, is that it seems to sort of lend itself to a very universal interpretation. So what does it mean to take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha? Well, the Buddha is thought of as the enlightened being, as the enlightened one. Bud means to awaken, so the Buddha is literally the awakened one, the one who has awoken from delusion, the one who has liberated himself or herself from suffering. In the traditional setting, it is referring to the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, so it is a he in that setting. But once we get into the Mahayana and Vajrayana traditions, then there are many, many Buddhas, and some of them are female, some of them male, some of them somewhat ambiguous. But we take refuge in this enlightened being. We take refuge in the awakened mind, that which is awake, okay? And if you have some deep reverence for the actual historical Buddha, that's wonderful as well. But fundamentally, why do we take refuge in the Buddha? We take refuge in the Buddha because it's the awakened mind. It is the mind towards which we all are trying to move. And it is the mind we are trying to awaken in our own being. And so the second factor of refuge is the Dharma, which is the way, the path, the teachings, the method for bringing us to Buddha, bringing us to awakening, bringing us to our true nature, bringing us to the divine. And so we revere and we take refuge in these teachings because we know that they are the means by which we will attain our heart's desire, our eternal longing to attain liberation and to be unified with our ground. And then finally, the Sangha is the community, the spiritual community, the community of in the traditional setting, this was thought of as like the Arya Sangha, which was the community of the awakened beings, or the community of the bodhisattvas, the community of those who are already very highly developed on the path. And so we take refuge in them as examples, as teachers, as beings who we can look to for guidance to keep us going on the path. And that's very important, because we need those examples. If we don't see those examples in our world, and if we don't hear teachings from them, then it's very difficult to find the inspiration on our own to engage in the practices and to maintain the joyful effort to continue in our practice all the way to the fruition. So that being said, there's also different ways of looking at Sangha. So the Sangha on the one hand could be this sort of community of enlightened beings who we turn to, but it's also our direct community of our spiritual friends, of those people who, what is a spiritual friend? Those people who are aligned with our deepest values and our deepest directionality of our life. Those beings who are going to help us move in the direction where we really want to go. Not where our maybe momentary desires want to go, but where we know on the deepest level that is the path I should be headed on. And so these spiritual friends also inspire us and keep us going, and bolster our faith and our devotion and our zeal to keep up the practice. And so these friends are indispensable. And as I've said before, the Buddha said to his disciple Ananda, spiritual friends are the whole path. And because if we don't have our spiritual friends, it is very difficult to move through the path, to move along the path. It's really an integral part of the movement of the whole path. And so whatever the tradition we follow, this refuge is somewhat the same. We're taking refuge in the highest principle, the awakened mind, the awakened being, God, the divine. We're taking refuge in the teachings that teach us about that highest principle, that teach us how to gain an understanding and contact and even union with that highest principle. And then our community, the congregation, the Sangha, who comes together and works together to all elevate. And of course, in the broadest sense, the Sangha is all beings, and especially all those beings moving towards higher levels of consciousness. But we can even expand our hearts more to think of this as literally all beings. And so that is what is known as the outer refuge, the refuge with signs, the refuge on sort of the relative level. But there's also a deeper refuge, which is just the very nature of being itself, which is your ground, pristine awareness, primordial consciousness, the kingdom of heaven within you. This is the deepest refuge. And this is the refuge that is always ever present right here in this moment. And this is it's a mystical refuge. It's a sudden, it's an immediate, it's a here and now refuge. It's here right now in this very moment. And so, and it's beyond all signs, symbols, all traditions, all doctrines, all philosophies and dogmas and anything. It's just the way things are. It's the ground of your being. And that is the deepest object of refuge, because it transcends objects. It transcends the very duality of subject and object that we are stuck in and that we are trying to get out of. And so as we approach this idea of refuge, which is really the beginning of the path, because it's the beginning of, okay, this is my new directionality, this is my new way of moving forward. We need to cultivate both of these refuges, because if we just rely on the inner refuge, we may sometimes not be able to connect to it. There may be times when it feels a little dry. And so those are the times when we need to turn to outer refuge, where we need to turn to the awakened beings, where we need to turn to the teachings in the form of the scriptures, of the books, of the oral teachings, and so on. And of when we need to turn to our spiritual friends to keep us going on the path. And so we have to really cultivate both of these. But fundamentally, terms of the path of meditation and the inward path of the mystical realization of the inner refuge, we have to recognize that that which we are looking for, the divine, the sublime, the freedom, is right here, and we will discover it right here in our present moment awareness, on the path of meditation, on the broader spiritual path. And so as each time we come into meditation, we typically do a few things. One, the first thing we do is we take refuge. It's sort of a reminder of, this is what I'm choosing to take refuge in, rather than doing some other activity that may or may not really be leading towards greater well-being, greater insight, greater enlightenment. I'm taking refuge in this practice which I know is leading me towards enlightenment, which is leading me towards greater well-being, greater understanding, and so on. And so in that moment, we can take refuge in the beings who brought us this practice, the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, the enlightened one, the teaching, and the community. And we can also then, on a deeper level, take refuge in the heart of our own being as we drop into meditation, and know that in this space of awareness that we are dropping into in meditation, that is where we will discover what we've always been looking for. So this is a very profound way of taking refuge. And in terms, what else does refuge mean? We could go, there's many things to consider in terms of refuge, but refuge also has to do with devotion and faith, and not because someone told you to have devotion or faith, but a natural devotion and faith for that which you find most meaningful, and for that which you have experienced as medicine. In other words, if you receive a practice from a tradition, from a teacher, and that practice really benefits you and really brings some deep meaning into your life, then some natural faith in that practice, in that being, in that tradition will naturally come up. And this is what the Buddha said. He said, don't take any of my words just out of blind faith in me. Put them into practice. Test them like you would test the validity of gold. And if it really turns out to be gold, then have faith, then have devotion, but not just because I said so. And so it's a path of discovery for each of us to see if the practices work, and if they do, then that will naturally create a faith and a devotion that will then bolster and deepen our refuge. And finally, I'll say that this is a very general presentation of refuge, but if we are interested in becoming a formal member of any religion, then we can take specific refuge. So, you can specifically take Jesus as your Savior, or you can specifically turn to Allah, or you can specifically take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha in a very official way, such that, you're taking, and you may even be with an understanding of sort of some universality of religion, but you feel, this path is the path that I want to focus on because it resonates most deeply with me. And then so you can formally actually take on that path as your main refuge. So the other aspect of refuge is that when you take refuge in the Buddhist tradition, you are also taking on the commitments of being in the path, which is sort of the vows to live by, the ethics. And quite simply, when you take refuge, you take the refuge vows, which for a layperson are the pratimoksha vows, or the vows of liberation, the vows of personal liberation. And so these are non-killing or protecting life, non-stealing or conversely giving, no false speech or conversely speaking the truth, no sexual misconduct or conversely bringing mindfulness and kindness and awareness to any engagement with sexuality, and finally no intoxicants or nothing that is going to bring you out of awareness such that you can then spiral into some sort of downward path. And so this is variously interpreted at different levels of practice, and so I can definitely say that not every Buddhist that I know does not engage in any intoxicants, and this is something we have to take on our own in our own way. But monks, for instance, they definitely don't take any intoxicants. But the fundamental issue at hand here is something that is going to bring us out of awareness, bring us out of mindfulness, bring us out of this connection to what we're going after. And so it should really be something that, that makes sense to us, not a restriction, but something that we feel is actually bringing us into deeper contact with that which we want to be in contact with. And that might mean, having some drinks here and there. You have to decide this on your own. But the main point in the refuge vows is that you're basically taking the vow to give up the harming of oneself and others. So you're giving up the negative acts against oneself and other. And that they call these the liberation vows, the freedom vows. And that's because, sort of the way we talked about ethics before, just by taking up this ethical conduct, you are already basically, and I've actually heard this very recently from a very high Rinpoche in Nepal, Chokyi Nyima Rinpoche. He said, and in this case he referred to the 10 unwholesome actions, or the 10 non-virtues, which are taking life, taking what is not given, sexual misconduct, lying, sowing discord, harsh speech, idle gossip, covetousness, ill will, and wrong views. And so he said, if we can just avoid the 10 non-virtues, that will guarantee that we do not take rebirth in lower realms. And so, and another way, and that's coming from a very traditional perspective, but as we said before, this is something we each have to figure out. Maybe this whole idea of realms is not a fairy tale after all, or maybe there's some truth to it. And even if we're not ready to go to that level, we can still see that by living virtuously in this way, our life is going to be so much more clean, so much more content and peaceful, because again, we're not going to be looking over our shoulder, we're not going to have guilt, we're just going to be in this sort of free space. Okay, so these are the refuge vows. So that's a brief understanding of refuge. And I encourage you to explore this for yourself. What is your refuge? What are your outer? Of course, I think for everybody, and you have to discover this for yourself, but I think for everybody, the inner refuge is the same. But the outer refuge may take on different forms. You may be inspired by one form over another form. And so you have to go on that path of discovery yourself. So that is the refuge aspect. And the next thing we'll move into is bodhicitta, or the vow of enlightenment, or the awakening mind, and how we cultivate that. And these are the two fundamental building blocks of the path. First, the refuge, and that which is actually going to bring us freedom. And then second, this deeper commitment to enlightenment that we'll get into in the next session.